Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. So imagine you're well into retirement, you have an investment advisor that's been managing your investments and you've decided to leave them, but you're not quite sure how exactly to take over your portfolio, how to manage it. You're also concerned about the stock market valuations. What steps should you take? Well, that's exactly what we're going to look at today. I got an email from a viewer, in fact, today, and I read it and it just resonated with me and I wanted to share it with you. So here it is. This is from a gentleman. He says, I'm 75 years old. Let me put me up there for whatever it's worth. I'm 75 years old. I've decided to take back my portfolio from my money manager and self-manage it. How does a 75-year-old go about this rather scary task of managing one's portfolio at this overvalued market time? I know that's got a lot of folks scared. My money manager has me at 60% equities, 40% laddered bonds. He has 19 ETFs for the equities portion, which I believe is excessive. Any suggestions you can offer would be welcome. So I'm going to walk through 6 things that I would probably do if I were in that situation, and hopefully maybe some of them can be useful to you. A couple of comments about the email. Let's go back to it. First of all, there's really no reason to have 19 ETFs, right? That doesn't necessarily mean it's hurting your performance. It depends on what the 19 ETFs are. It could be a perfectly well diversified portfolio. My hunch, the viewer didn't list the tickers, and that's fine. My hunch is there's a lot of overlap among those ETFs. It could be a really poorly constructed portfolio. Don't get me wrong, but just because it's 19 doesn't mean it's harming you in any way. Is it excessive? Well, I guess it's hard for me to say definitively since I haven't seen the portfolio, but yeah, it's probably excessive. I could have $100 million and I wouldn't need 19 ETFs. It just doesn't, I suppose if I'm trying to think of a situation, maybe if you're very particular and you want a very precise percentage of your portfolio in small cap value and large cap growth and international, and you could come up with some reason to think you need 19 ETFs. And if you've managed it and that's what you want to do, you'll get no argument from me. It's certainly not what I do. And I think it's unnecessary. And if in my more cynical moments, I think advisors do that to make it look like what they do is harder than it is. So, but be that as it may not be hurting you. It could still be a perfectly fine, low cost, diversified portfolio. But yeah, 19 ETFs is it's ridiculous. Okay. The second thing is laddered bonds. So this is where you buy typically individual bonds. Could be U.S. government bonds, corporate bonds. You could, in theory, include municipal bonds. And you ladder them, not unlike you'd ladder a CD where the bonds mature perhaps every year over some period of time. That can certainly be a reasonable strategy. I tend to prefer just to have bond funds, but I'm certainly not here to say that's a bad strategy. That could be very reasonable. And I might even consider leaving it alone, depending on what it is. There may not be a need to make changes. So just a couple of observations there. Now let's get into the 6 things that I would consider. And here they are. Let's first talk about some retirement planning. The first thing I would think about from a retirement planning perspective is, just to put it bluntly, how long do I think I'm going to live? And that would be true, by the way, at any age, right? It's not that this person's 75, so we need to think about it. You need to think about it anytime you're creating a retirement plan. Of course, we in most cases, we don't know how long we're going to live. For me, I tend to assume 95. I think it's kind of, on the conservative side. Most people don't live to be 95, and most couples don't. Now, if you're dealing with a couple, obviously the odds of one of them living to 95 is, of course, higher than if you're dealing with an individual. But, that doesn't mean you should assume 95, but that's what I do. But it's important. In fact, we're going to look at FICalc in just a second. This is a free tool I talk about on the show from time to time. And one of the things, the very first thing it wants to know is duration. How long is your retirement plan going to last? So for this individual, we'll just assume 95. We'll put in 25 years and we'll come back to this. The second question, and arguably the most important from a planning perspective, is your burn rate. That is, what percentage of your retirement savings are you spending each year? So we of course, talk about the 4% rule a lot on this show. And so maybe your burn rate is 4%, but this individual's 75, And so if we're assuming a 20-year retirement, you can spend a little bit more with the same chance of success because you've got a 20-year planning period. The 4% rule was based on an assumption of a 30-year planning period. So we can go back to FI Calc. And if we look at this, we're just using $1 million portfolio. The real focus is percentages. We could change that and just change the withdrawal amount. But at I put 25 in there, didn't I? I'm sorry, I meant 20. At a 20-year duration, a planning period, 4% succeeds. And again, this is based on historical market returns and inflation. And I just remembered I need to change the stock allocation, which we can do in this tool. It's very easy. 60% stocks, 40% bonds. Now, I don't know what type of stocks, what asset classes that he has. So, but this is good enough for our purposes, right? And it's still 100%. So we could actually look at the details down here, year by year. One of the things you can say, well, that's all green, so we don't need to look at it. But this actually tells you more than just success or failure. You'll see these icons. Can you see that money bag right there? It's really tiny. I can make it a little bigger maybe. That means that after 30 years, you had a truckload of money. And in fact, you can see the amount. This is if you retired in 1987 after 20 years, spending an inflation-adjusted amount every year. You've got over $2 million. Good for you, I guess. I don't know. Is that good or bad? Anyway, it's what it is. And then if you see this face down here that looks like this little emoji is going to get sick, that's because they didn't run out of money, but they came real close. So in this case, retiring in 1969, you were down to about 200 grand. And so you can see a lot of them, and you notice they're grouped together. It's because we go through different regimes. In this case, it was sort of 1960s, because when you retired then, you got hit with high inflation in the 70s and early 80s. It made it really difficult for retirees. And again, assuming 20 years, it didn't fail, but it was a bumpy ride. So you can learn a lot about different periods of time, even if they succeeded. But in any event, so at 40,000, you still have a 100% success rate. So you could play with this. 45,000, let's see what happens. Still 100%. How about 50,000? That's a 5% withdrawal. You're down to 96.3. And again, you could look at the details. So that's the how you could use this information. Again, this is a free, very simple tool to use. But the burn rate is really important. And you can drill down on that some more. You can say, okay, well, my burn rate, we'll just use what we put in here. My burn rate might be 50,000. And just to be clear, this is how much you're spending from your retirement savings. That's what the viewer was asking about. Hopefully, you've got Social Security. You may have other forms of guaranteed income. So you're spending that. But the idea here is, even beyond your guaranteed income, how much do you have to pull out of your portfolio, your retirement savings? So let's assume it's 50,000, just for sake of discussion. I like to think about that money, that amount, between essential spending and discretionary. How much of that do you need just to keep the lights on, have 3 meals a day, heat the house in the winter, that sort of thing? And how much of it is discretionary? It may be, by the way, the discretionary spending could be really important to you. Our discretionary spending is important to me, right? I want to take a little vacation every now and again, or go out to eat from time to time, or have a Netflix subscription. So it's not that discretionary spending is unimportant. It could be very important to you. But it is true that if you couldn't spend that money, you'd survive, right? So that's sort of the idea. And I think this is a very important way to look at your retirement plan, because part of retirement planning is not just the math. It's living with the plan that you end up with, whether you're doing this on your own or with an advisor, some help. You got to live with it. It's not just a math in a spreadsheet or in a retirement planning tool. And at least knowing that your essential expenses will be covered, I think, at least it gives me great comfort. I think it gives most people a lot of comfort. And that can have a lot of different positive effects. Obviously, it can help you sleep at night. Maybe that's the most important. But it might also give you comfort in how you ultimately choose to invest your money, and living with the ups and downs of the stock market. If you know your next meal doesn't depend on the stock market returning 10% every year, which of course we know it doesn't. So I think this is a very important way to look at your spending. And it brings me to number 4, the guaranteed income coverage ratio. That sounds fancier than it really is. All we do is say, okay, we do 2 things. We say, first of all, what are our sources? Now we're talking about guaranteed income, so we're moving away from the investment portfolio for just a minute. What are our sources of guaranteed income? So what is that? Social Security, could be a pension, could be an annuity, maybe part-time work if you're working a little bit. It could also, I would include a TIPS bond ladder. TIPS are Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. I include those. You could have a nominal regular U.S. Treasury bond ladder or a muni bond ladder or a CD ladder, and those are all are tools worth having in some circumstances. But they're not inflation protected. They don't guarantee you, this increase with inflation. A TIPS ladder does. Now, you might say, well, if that's the case, forget all those other bonds. If they don't protect me from inflation, I want the inflation protection. Well, remember, there's no free lunch. So TIPS in general, whether you're buying just an individual TIPS, creating a ladder, buying a TIPS fund, there's a cost associated with that inflation protection. What is it? Lower yields. So, there's no free lunch. If you don't need the protection of a TIPS ladder, then, you might still have some TIPS, but you wouldn't certainly put all of your bond investments in TIPS. And so you just keep in mind that TIPS are they're a tool to be used, whether as a ladder or otherwise, but they're not some magic. They're not some silver bullet. They have, I think, very nice features, but those features come at a cost. So that's just something to keep in mind. But I do put that in sort of what I would call guaranteed income. So you add all of that up, your guaranteed income, and then you compare it to your essential expenses. Again, the things you need to spend to keep the lights on. And what percentage of your essential spending does the guaranteed income cover? Now, for a lot of people that email me, they say it's 100%. I could live off of my guaranteed income, they tell me. Now, if that's you, that's a really strong position to be in, because again, it means that everything that you have in your savings that you're going to invest into the market, whether it's fixed income or stocks, you want it to do well. You may be relying on that money to do some important things in your retirement, but you don't have to rely on it to keep the lights on. And I think it's important to understand where that is for you. Now, for some of you, you say, well, Rob, that's great, but my guaranteed income won't cover everything. That's okay. And it doesn't cover everything for us. But knowing how much it covers, I think, can help you understand how to think through what to do with your retirement savings. Now, I want to stress, it's not as if you can figure out how much your guaranteed income covers your essential expenses, and out of that formula pops out, some investment plan. It doesn't work that way. There's still a lot of judgment, and we'll come back to that. But I think it's a good metric to keep an eye on. And you can always, if you choose, increase your guaranteed income, right? By building a TIPS ladder, one option, possibly buying a fixed annuity, a single premium, immediate annuity. Again, these are tools to consider if you feel a need to increase your guaranteed income. And some part of it's personality. Some really want that. Wade Pfau, who does a lot of retirement research, calls that the safety first person. They want some sort of insurance contract, some sort of guarantee that's really important to them. Others are like, yeah, no, I'm okay investing. I like he calls that a probability base, because we're just making decisions based on historical analysis and Monte Carlo simulations and the probability of what's going to happen. But a lot of people are like, yeah, Rob, I'm good with that. I feel very comfortable. It's not that there's a right or a wrong. They're both, different ways to sort of get at the same ultimate goal, that is, a healthy financial retirement. But again, understanding how much of your guaranteed income will take care of your essential spending, I think, is a big part of that. Okay. Number 5, we get to the point of a diversified portfolio. And again, here, it's going to come down in large part to your burn rate. How much of this diversified portfolio do you need to spend each year? We can see here that if it's somewhere around 5%, again, we're assuming a 20-year duration. And by the way, the actual numbers don't matter. I could put in 100,000, right? And if I put in here 5,000, which is 5%, I'm getting the same 96.3. So don't worry that I'm using a specific number that probably doesn't apply to you. You can use this tool and put in your own number, right? It's still 5%, right? So that's our burn rate. If we look at this, and we're assuming a 60-40 portfolio, historically, it's almost never failed. Now, again, you could say, well, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that. Okay, well, you have options. You can reduce your withdrawal rate. That's what, you could say, okay, instead of 5,000, I'm gonna do 4,500. It's 100%. Again, future could be different. So you might even say, well, I'm not even comfortable with that. You're probably a safety first person, and maybe the answer is to increase your guaranteed income. Again, I know I'm speaking in generalities, but that's the best I can do. These are the things I would think through. But with the diversified portfolio, I do think it's worth addressing the viewer's question about the fact that the market's overvalued. I would push back on this and say some markets are overvalued, but they aren't all overvalued. And let me show you. Here's the S&P 500. This happens to just be a Vanguard fund. It's forward-looking PE, which means its current price divided by the estimate of its earnings over the next 12 months. In this case, the estimated earnings of all of the companies that make up the S&P 500, 23.6, and there's no question that is overvalued as compared to history. No question about it. In fact, I was looking at some material by Howard Marks, who is a very well-known investor, particularly in high-yield fixed income. And he references a JP Morgan study that basically said at this elevated level, the next 10 years, whenever the market has been at this level, the following 10-year returns have been basically around zero. Yeah, it could be a couple of percentage positive, but it's never been more than that. And now, I can't predict what the next 10 years will look like, but I can say that this is richly valued. But that's the S&P 500. Let's jump over to the international market. Now we're looking at Vanguard's Total International Stock Fund. We could look at other funds, but this is just to give us an idea. This is a very broadly diversified international stock fund. Their PE is under 15. That's not overvalued. Now, that doesn't mean it can't go lower, by the way, just like an overvalued investment can go up. But if we're just looking at valuations and comparing them to history, that is not overvalued. How about something like Schwab U.S. Dividend Equity? I own shares of this. That's not, by the way, not a recommendation, but just to disclose that. Actually, I own shares, at least indirectly, through VXUS as well. But in any event, this is it's a dividend fund, but you can see it's a very much value focused. Its PE is under 14. Now, I suppose if you were going to compare that, you'd compare it to other value funds, but I certainly wouldn't call that overvalued. Again, doesn't mean it won't go down, but I wouldn't call that overvalued. And small cap, now this is not small cap value. This is just small cap. You could look at a small cap value fund, but its price to PE ratio is around 17. So maybe a tad on the high side, but again, I wouldn't call that overvalued, at least not in any way that something like the S&P 500 is. And by the way, if we focus on just tech stocks, which we could do through the QQQ, just as an example, and we go to the portfolio, its PE is 28. So when you get to the growth side of large cap in the US, based on historical numbers, definitely overvalued. But here's the thing. This is why I think a diversified portfolio is so important. Personally, I would still have exposure to these overvalued assets, probably in the form of a total US stock market fund, which is going to have a little bit of everything. But I also might tilt my portfolio a bit towards value, perhaps with a fund like SCHD, perhaps with additional exposure to small cap. And certainly, I would have international exposure, and in fact, I do. And so when I look at my portfolio, is it exposed to some of these investments that are based on a historical basis overvalued? Yeah. But the portfolio as a whole is more reasonably valued because I've got about 20% in international, another 10% in small cap companies, not a huge allocation to the Schwab fund that I showed you, but some. And so my overall portfolio is not nearly as richly valued as large cap tech in the US. Now, again, I want to stress, if the market crashes, my portfolio is going down, but it's not nearly as overvalued as large cap growth in the U.S. So hopefully it wouldn't go down as much as those might go down in a bad market. But to me, the key is a diversified portfolio. Now here you say, okay, Rob, appreciate that, but I want specifics. Well, I can't give you specifics, right? I don't know your situation. I don't know your philosophy. I don't know how much these decisions will stress you out at night and keep you awake. I don't know how much you need from your retirement savings for essential expenses, right? But I do have some ideas on how you can get some help. And that was the last point I wanted to make: get help. So what I like, particularly for something like this, that someone who wants to move away from an individual that's going to actually manage their money, there are advisors out there that for an hourly or flat fee will look at your portfolio for you, evaluate it, look at your circumstances in retirement, even give you a retirement plan. I have a list here you can consider. I have no financial relationship with any of these individuals. I know some of them, some I don't. I've personally used Mark Zorel. And he doesn't actually manage investments. So even if you wanted to, at least as far as I know, there may be some exceptions, but generally he doesn't do that. But he can absolutely give you a retirement plan and suggest an investment portfolio. And you can see this, you want to make sure that this hasn't changed, but the first year is $389. I mean, goodness, that's pretty inexpensive. I'll also mention Chris Urban. So I actually had coffee with Chris this morning, the first time I ever met him. He bought me. So I said I don't have any financial interest in any of these individuals. Well, technically, I guess I do, because Chris bought me a cup of coffee this morning, although it wasn't for being on this page. He's been on this page for a long time. But we met, and he seems like a nice guy. I've never used his services. So in that sense, I can't recommend him, but he'd be someone else that you could consider. He charges $395 an hour. Of course, you'd want to understand how much time he'd need to put in. But the point is, there's plenty of ways to get help, short of having someone actually take over your investments and manage them for you. You can manage them yourself, and you can spend a little bit of money. Could be a few hundred, could be a few thousand. Get a retirement plan, get a plan of action for your investments, and it might give you some comfort and confidence that you've got this. And you could ask them, obviously, all the questions that you have, and they're going to be able to give you some advice that's specifically tailored to your set of circumstances. So there you go. Hopefully you've found this helpful. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll be happy to help you out any way I can. And until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.